This presentation covers the preterite and the imperfect. The imperfect and the preterite tenses can be understood by contrasting them. Look at the following sentences and notice the differences in the verbs in red versus the verbs in blue. Yo dormía cuando sonó la alarma. I was sleeping when the alarm went off. Ella llegó mientras cenábamos. And the translation, she came over while we were having dinner. Me cepillaba los dientes cuando él me llamó. Give me a second for the translation. I was brushing my teeth when he called me. Me fui porque ellos discutían. I left because they were arguing. So what's the difference between the verbs in red versus the verbs in blue? I'm going to show you the slide again. You may want to pause the slideshow so you can really think about what's going on here. Pause. In each sentence, obviously, we're talking about past events. However, the verbs in red indicate actions that were somehow continuing, while the verbs in blue interrupted them. One of my favorite podcasts, Coffee Break Spanish, used an example similar to this. He talked about sentences like this, as in the imperfect is la 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 la, continuing along when all of a sudden, whap, the preterite interrupted that action. So if you remember this simple dichotomy, it'll help you to use the proper tense most of the time. Now I want to review some sentences that contain trigger phrases that signal whether to use the imperfect versus the preterite. Again, as you review the sentences, pay attention to the underlying differences between the trigger phrases in red versus those in blue. A veces comíamos los postres antes de la cena. Go ahead and translate that. Sometimes we would eat dessert before dinner. Ana siempre llamaba a su mamá. Translation: Ana always called her mother. And notice I have the word a between llamaba and su mamá highlighted. That's what's known as the personal a. Whenever the direct object of a verb is a person or an animal we treat like a person, we need to use the personal a. Ayer fuimos al cine por primera vez en 5 meses. Go ahead and translate. Yesterday, we went to the movies for the first time in 5 months. Esta mañana manejé a Payson para visitar a mi mamá. Go ahead and translate. This morning, I drove to Payson to visit my mom. Again, what's the difference between the verbs in red versus those in blue? Look again. You may want to pause it so you can figure out what's going on here. Pause, 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 pause. The trigger phrases in blue refer to specific time periods with more definite beginnings and endings. Una vez, one time, anoche, last night, esta mañana, this morning, ayer, yesterday. All of these are pointing to a definite time period, whereas the phrases in red are more amorphous. They don't have definite beginnings and endings. A veces, sometimes, siempre, always, todos los años, every year, a menudo, often. The phrases in red often refer to repeated or habitual actions in the past, so we're going to be using the imperfect. Let's quickly review more sentences with trigger phrases. Íbamos a México todos los años para visitar a mi hermana mayor. Go ahead and translate. We used to go to Mexico every year to visit my older sister. Jorge llegaba tarde a la clase a menudo. Often, Jorge would come to class late. No pude dormir anoche por pensar en mi trabajo. Go ahead and translate. I couldn't sleep last night for thinking about my work. Una vez fui al hospital porque creí que tenía apendicitis. I went to the hospital once because I thought I had appendicitis. So pay attention to the English translations of the verbs. Again, go ahead and take a moment to pause this slide so you can look at what's going on. Pause, 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 pause. If the English sentence contains a verb in the simple past, the Spanish sentence will most often be in the preterite. If, however, the English sentence uses was, were plus a gerund, I was walking, we were eating, or would plus a conjugated verb, we would go to the movies, we would visit my uncle, or used to plus an infinitive, we used to swim every summer, we used to get ice cream for my birthday, you're going to use the imperfect. Final points. In my experience, the preterite is used more often than the imperfect in day-to-day conversations. It's easy to overthink everything and get confused. Don't worry so much. There's some overlap in the tenses, so you have a little bit of wiggle room. And what's the worst that can happen? If you use the incorrect past tense in conversation, you will still be understood. Moreover, people can ask you, well, what did you mean? Remember, learning requires that we make mistakes. Thank you for listening to my slide.